get going. So, here comes Sally. We'll wait for 13 more seconds.
So if anybody brought something to eat that has no grains, no dairy, and no sugar in it, raise their hand.
You did that.
You didn't.
You brought something that has no grains.
Took you a jump.
Rice is
let's
a
go
grain.
rice.
Rice is a grain. Hat.
Yeah.
No.
That's
So,
Tell me your name again.
Ian.
Ian. Oh, good names.
all right.
Yes.
I would better
Start.
name it.
Let's go ahead and get going here. So,
I am blessed.
all right. Well, Lord Jesus, we're just grateful for, again, being able to come together and, again, just being able to hear from you, Lord, and the fact that you would give us your word, that we can look into it and that we can enjoy one another as we do so, and we can learn about you and fall in love with you, Lord. And so I just ask that that would be the case as we study your word, and that you would be magnified in this process. Lord. In your name, amen. Okay, so we've sludged our way now through John 14. We did it. We made it through verse 31 last time. So we'll jump into John 15 as we go into today, and we'll see how far we can get. I do want to just back up just a little bit, set the stage for John 15. Remember, in John 13 and 14, we're really looking at Jesus with his disciples in what would be considered the upper room discourse, the Last Supper, the Passover feast with his disciples. So, backing up then to verse 30 of John 14, I will speak much more. I will not speak much more with you, for the ruler of the world is coming, and he has nothing in me. So we talked a little bit about that last week, just the fact that false accusations would come against him, and those false accusations would, of course, lead to his crucifixion. He says, but that the world may know that I love the Father, and as the Father gave me a commandment, even so I do. Arise, let us go from here. So, ending that kind of that John 13, 14 discourse with this, he says, now let's arise and go from here. So, they're leaving the room. It's really difficult to say exactly, where they're going, what they're passing in that time period. But certainly their destination, his destination, is going to be the Garden of Gethsemane, where he will then pray, of course, in anguish, really, and ask that this cup that he's about to have to face be removed from him. And according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Luke, he sweats blood in that case. John doesn't actually cover that, so we won't see that in this. He doesn't mention it. So, okay. Now, jumping into John 15. We've already read some of John 15. We'll go ahead and go through it a little bit. I just kind of gave a brief, read through of it. We read through verse 7 of it. But this is a really, I guess it would be popular, if you will, famous, well-known, I think is probably a good word for it, in terms of the passage, well-known amongst, within people that attend church on a regular basis. Okay. The idea here will be this vineyard, and the symbolism that we see, right? I mean, it's pretty clear what he's trying to say here, but the symbolism is actually something that would extend beyond what we might be able to see if you're not real familiar with the Old Testament, that certainly the disciples would have recognized. All right, so let me go ahead and just flip to Isaiah 5. The vineyard is something that you definitely see in terms of symbolism in the Old Testament as a picture of Israel. Isaiah 5 is a really good passage to look at in terms of what this would look like and what his disciples would have possibly been thinking of when he started using this, I am the vine and you are the branches. Okay, and that is Isaiah 5. We'll just read the first 7 verses really to just give the context for verse 7. All right, the first 2 verses are something that Isaiah was essentially singing, and then you have a comment from the Lord or from God, starting in verse 3. So, verse 1, Isaiah 5, let me sing now for my well-beloved, a song of my beloved concerning his vineyard. My well-beloved had a vineyard on a fertile hill, and he dug it all around. Now this would be God, and he dug it all around, removed its stone, and planted it with the choicest vine, and he built a tower in the middle of it, and hewed out a wine vat in it. Then he expected it to produce good grapes, but it produced only worthless ones. Now God's comment on this. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? Why when I expected it to produce good grapes, did it produce worthless ones? So now let me tell you what I am going to do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it will be consumed. I will break down its walls, and it will be become trampled ground. And I will lay it waste. It will not be pruned or hoed, but briars and thorns will come up. I will also charge the clouds to rain no rain on it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his delightful plant. Right, so that's, verse 7, the house of the Lord is his vineyard. Okay, now what you see here is God's displeasure with the nation of Israel at that point in time, and their worshiping of idols. And so this is a prophecy saying that Israel, the land of Israel, will be trampled underground. Okay, so obviously symbolic languages. Okay, or language. So when you see this, and when we read chapter 15, in particular the first about 10 verses of chapter 15, certainly the disciples would have recognized that symbolism. That symbolism is being extended certainly to the church and more intimately to the individual believer, certainly his disciples and certainly us. Okay, that he is again now the vine and we are the branches. So let's go ahead and start reading in chapter 15, verse 1. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Right? Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that bears fruit, he prunes it, that it may bear more fruit. You're already clean because of the word which I have spoken to you. So this idea that we would bear fruit. Now, that word prune and the word clean, this is what I have in my version. So in verse 2, it says, he prunes it that it may bear more fruit. In verse 3, it says, you are already clean because of the word which I have spoken to you. That word is essentially the same word in the Greek. Okay, and 1 John 1:9, I won't flip there, but 1 John 1:9, in that verse, John says that if we confess our sins, God is faithful and just to forgive us and cleanse us of all our unrighteousness. That word, cleanse us of all our unrighteousness, same word, cleanse. Okay, and I think I've mentioned this with this group, but the word really is the same word that we get our word catheter from. It's catharizo. All right, and catheter, right? Yes, right. Yeah. So you think about a catheter and what a catheter does. Of course, catheter is placed into a person, to, just a second, bud. But anyway, placed into a person to remove the poison, right? So that's the idea here, catharizo, to cleanse, to remove, to take away, okay? Now, Ian, did you have a question?
Yeah, what does that word mean? Catheter?
Catheter? Well, I was just explaining it. But you were talking to Mom. Catheter is something that doctors will put, it's essentially a tube that they put into your bladder. So if you have had a surgery or something that is going to render you unable to walk, then they'll oftentimes put a catheter in you to remove urine from your system until you regain your mobility so you can pee on your own. Okay.
Otherwise you poison yourself.
You poison yourself. Urine becomes very toxic.
So you don't even have to pee.
You do, it's just the way you're getting rid of it.
It's just your way you're getting rid of it. Yep. Okay? So that's the idea, right? And you'll notice here, of course, he says, you were already clean because of the word, right? The word that I've spoken to you. So again, this idea of sanctification or sanctification process, kind of what I've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, this idea of thinking like he thinks and desiring what he desires and acting like what he would act like, okay? Now, verse 4, so abide in me and I in you as the branch, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine. So neither can you unless you abide in me. Oh, he brought his treats.
Mark,
More cookies. Good job, Michael. Way to go. No, those are good. Those are cake cookies, or yeah. Everyone's like eyeing them. Like, oh, there's only 8 of them. And how many? 1, 2. Okay. Anyway, all right. So, verse 4 is where we are. Chapter 15, verse 4. Okay. All right. So, I'll go ahead and read the verse again. So, abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine. So neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who abides in me, and I am in him, he bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Now, I'm going to take a little bit of time and look at this verse. So we have here again one of these spiritual laws. And if you guys, I don't know if you remember, I think it was the last semester that we talked about a spirit. No, maybe it was here. Maybe it was during the semester, but I can't remember. The last spiritual law that we saw was actually kind of explained by 1 John. So if you flip to 1 John real quick, I presented it in this way, right? Laws are something that you can't escape. The law of gravity works all the time, right? We simply cannot escape it. You can not believe in the law of gravity, but it doesn't matter. The law of gravity works regardless of your position on it. So spiritual laws are in some ways like that, okay? So 1 John 4, verse 7 is where I'll start reading. I'll read a couple of verses and then skip down to verse 19, where it really expresses the spiritual law. But it says, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. The one who does not love does not know God, for God is love. By this, the love of God is manifested in us, that God has sent his only begotten Son into the world so that we might live through him. In this is love. Not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins." Skip down to verse 19. "We love because he first loved us." That's the spiritual law. The love of the Father is expressed towards us, and then we respond to that. He doesn't respond to us. We respond to him. Okay? Now, if you look at then this, verse 4 and 5 of chapter 15 is another one of these spiritual laws. And Jesus puts it right by an agricultural law, if you will, quote unquote. Branches can't bear fruit without being in the vine. That's very clear, okay? Well, that's what he's saying here. You can't bear fruit unless you're abiding in me and I in you. Now that fruit, let's go ahead and look at that. I want to spend some time thinking about this because I think there's some really interesting things that we can launch off from here. But this fruit, let's look at this. I'm going to flip to Galatians 5. Okay? Galatians 5 is in the New Testament, Becky.
Do you want to stand up when I get there?
That would be great, if you could. I'm almost there. Galatians 5, I'm there. And I don't tell you the verse, because that way I'm always at the verse first. Okay, the verse is, let's look at verse 22. Okay, let's look at verse 22. So this is something that if you're familiar with the Bible, you probably have heard this verse as well. We could really, the thought for Paul to the Galatians really starts in verse 16. It says, "But I say to you, walk by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desires of the flesh." Okay, walk by the Spirit. That would be Paul's terminology of abide in him and let him abide in you. Right? So he goes on to then go through that. I'd encourage you to read it on your own, but he says in verse 22, he says, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love and joy and peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against these there is no law." That's the fruit of the Spirit. Okay. And when we think about fruit, you think about an orange tree, or you think about even a vineyard, what we're talking about. The branches produce the fruit because of what's in the tree, the DNA. They're destined to do so because of what's in the tree. And that's what Jesus is saying here, is that these fruits will be a natural outcome of my Spirit abiding in you and you abiding in me. That's the outcome of this, okay? Now without that, just like the vine, can't produce grapes without, I'm sorry, not the vine, but the branch can't produce grapes without the vine, neither can we produce these fruits without him in us and we in him. Okay? Now, I wanted to go ahead and kind of investigate something here that really helped me take a little bit of a break from John 15, and we'll come right back to John 15, but when you start to think about this, and we start to think about even like God is love, okay, and we start to think about those fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. If you were to go throughout the United States and you had a little box, right, that said good and a little box that said bad, and you could check mark one, and you just start to interview people in the United States, and you can go abroad and start to interview and start to say, are these good things or are they bad things? And you just kept the check mark and you interview all of essentially humanity. Just take one, love, okay? Is it a virtue or is it a vice? Is it good? Is it bad? You would be hard pressed to find someone that would say that's bad and hatred is good. It's universal almost amongst the human race that love is good. Okay, one of these what we would consider fruits of the Spirit. Right. So, as I consider that to me, and I think like a scientist, is a piece of data. Right. We have almost universally across the human race the expression that love is a good thing. Okay. So where does that come from? Right? What can explain the existence of this universal appraisal that love is good? Okay, and in other words, what I'm essentially saying here is what worldview, when pressed to its presuppositional lens, supports the fact that all human beings think that love is good. That's a piece of data, right? That needs to be explained. Okay, and this is why I'm a Christian. Because Christianity has great, what I would call, explanatory power. Thinking like a scientist. That's what I do. I think like a scientist. It answers the questions. Right? So if you think about it this way, right, and you start to answer this question, all that exists came from what? In other words, where did all this come from? Right? Now, scientists, and we're on the side of science with this statement, that the universe had a beginning. There is very good reasons to believe, from a scientific standpoint, that the universe began to exist at some point in the finite past. Okay? So we're on the side of science there. Now, what can explain the existence of all those things, and then the nature of the existence of all those things? Right? So think about this. The worldview, there's how many worldviews, right? I mean, you could think about how many religions are in the world. It's dizzying, probably, to think about it. Religions are in the world, right? Different religions, different belief systems. However, if you could really boil them down to really three different things when you start to answer this question, how did all this come into existence? One, there was nothing, and then something came about, and then something brought about the world, which is a really kind of strange view, because usually something doesn't come from nothing. Okay, that's kind of weird. The second one, what's that?
It's a tenet of science. Nothing.
Right. You have to, right, exactly, right? So that's a very difficult pill to swallow when you say nothing, there was nothing, and then there was something. Okay?
It was a big bang.
Right. So now the impersonal would be the next thing. And so that there was something, there was energy, there was this cosmos, there was a force, there was something that was there, and that something then inexplicably directed the universe to bring us to where we are today. Right? And honestly, this is adhered to in many of what might be considered the Eastern religions, where there is this kind of this impersonal energy and force. And I'm not, I don't know much about Buddhism, I don't know much about Hinduism, but I know enough to say that, there's this kind of impersonal beginning of everything that we all came from and that we're all being absorbed back into. Okay, that would be that branch. And then the last explanation for the existence of the universe would be that there was this personal being that brought it all into existence. The personal being existed before it was there, and then after it, and he created it. Right? Now, when we start to then look at this data point, all of humanity says that love exists, and that not only that love exists, that love is good. Okay, let's look at our worldviews and let's press them to their presuppositional lens, and let's look at really nothing brought us all into existence, or the impersonal brought us all into existence, lead to the same conclusion. Okay, and let's take the extreme, atheism. Okay, you're an atheist. You don't believe that God exists, and if you don't believe that God exists, then certainly nothing had to bring this all into existence, or there was something, some energy or something like that. It's hard to say exactly what they believe at that point in time, but the universe began to exist at some point in time, right? But there's nothing personal to it. And we are here, and when you start to think about the human being, we're here because of cosmic accident, okay? And the human being then, in their mind, is a really complex biochemical reaction that has yet to reach equilibrium.
That what?
That has yet to reach equilibrium, yet to die. Okay, so it's a biochemical reaction, right? So when we then, and the atheist says, well, I love my daughter, what they're really saying is that there's this complex biochemical process going on in my brain that produces this feeling in me that I call love. But it's not really love. It's just a biochemical process that produces a feeling of love that causes action. Okay, that same set of chemicals could have just as easily produced a feeling of hatred toward the child, and they would be the same. It'd just be a feeling, right? The hatred or the love. Either one is a biochemical reaction of differing qualities, different feelings as a result. So neither one of them really exists. Hate and love are not. One is not better than the other. However, again, we come back to the piece of data. Love universally is accepted as being something that's good, and hate is universally accepted as being something wrong. Okay? So atheism falls short of explaining the way that the world exists. Okay? Now, go to Christianity. Right? When we start to think about Christianity, and we start to think about God, right? Without creation, God existed, correct? Now, did he exist alone? You're saying no. No, he didn't. He didn't exist alone.
He didn't, but he did.
Well, okay.
Because they're all three in one.
Okay.
God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but they are three people.
Exactly, right? So, but there's three of them, right? But they are one,
but
right?
they're one.
Right. So that's difficult to wrap our minds around. But there's three, and because there's three, without creation, there was the potential, and not only the potential, but there could be love. The Holy Spirit, right? God the Spirit could love God the Son, and God the Son could love the Father, and they could work in the circle. So love existed without creation. They didn't need creation to express love. They could love. And when we look at then what we just read in John, God is love. Right? So when we come back to this, so that's the explanatory power of Christianity, that we can say that love is good because it is rooted and grounded in the nature of who God is, and he is good. Right? And then the antithesis of that, the opposite of that, would be hate, and it was bad, and it is bad. So we can explain the existence and the nature of reality, okay, when we look at the Christian faith. So coming back to what Jesus is saying here, okay, that's a little bit of excursus out of the passage, but come back to the passage. And he says this, he says, for apart from me, you can do nothing. It's more than just a statement of like you really need my strength to help you do these things. It's without me, these things wouldn't even exist. It wouldn't exist, the fruit that I'm asking you to bear and that you should be bearing: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. Those things are rooted and they're grounded in the very existence of who God is. He is all those things. Scripture tells us he is love, but he's these other things as well. Okay, he is self-controlled. He is these things, right? So when we start to think about then this idea of him abiding in us, the Holy Spirit, and then us abiding in him, that's what was being said. That to produce these fruits, you must have this abiding going on. Him and us, which happens at our rebirth, But then us abide in him, because he does say he puts a responsibility on us. He says in verse 4, abide in me. So he's giving us a command, and we've talked a little bit about that. Okay? That idea of producing an environment, number one, in which we can become sensitive to his promptings. The Holy Spirit prompts us. Sounds a lot like us, but he prompts us to do the right thing. Okay? And then when we're prompted, the next part of is us simply surrendering our will to his own. I don't necessarily want to do that. Well, the Holy Spirit is saying, no, you need to do this. And then we have to surrender our will to his. Okay, so there's that. That's abiding. Becoming sensitive to those promptings and then surrendering our will to him.
We don't belong to ourselves.
That would be true. That's right. As a Christian, we would want to follow Jesus' commands to us to take up our cross and to follow him, to do his will, not our own.
Brought with a place.
Exactly. So spiritual law. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Okay. Now, with that in mind, let's go ahead and read the rest of this passage, and let's just kind of comment as we go on and try and understand this. So, verse 6.
We're back to John.
Back to John, verse 6. Chapter 15, verse 6. He goes on and says this. He says, if anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away as a branch and dries up, and they gather them and cast them into the fire, and they are burned. Right, so, the opposite of what's going on here, right? So a person that does not surrender their will to the Lord, does not abide in him, then is at war with him. Right? And for God then to create the world that he wants to create, the end, look at Revelation 21, 22, without death, without suffering, without pain, there can't be war. And then there can't be an opposition to his will. Okay, and that's what is being essentially said here. Now, verse 7, he says, but if you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it shall be done for you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit, and so prove to be my disciples. So, again, this abiding, we're now at harmony with him. Okay, and when we're in harmony with him, then this amazing prayer request is given to us. He says, ask what you wish and it shall be done for you. But our will is his will, and what we desire is what he desires. Okay, so we're in harmony with that and doesn't have a problem giving them those requests to us. And he then goes on to say that you'll bear much fruit, and you will then prove to be my disciples from that. Okay, we should, as Christians, bear fruit that would be recognizable, that's a representation of God. And it says that God might be glorified is simply that the Father might be known, might be made known, that his will, that his desire would be made known to humanity. Okay? Now, verse 9, just as the Father then has loved me, I have also loved you. Abide in my love. So now this is an extension of what it means to abide in it. All right, look at verse 9. It says, he starts it off, he says, just as the Father loved me, I have also loved you. This love that I was talking about, a triune God, without creation, there's three of them. Love exists between them for all of eternity. So as long as they've existed, that love has existed. Okay, that's the love that the Father has for the Son. It's never changed, right? And then when creation happened and it didn't change, and then he sent him here, didn't change, right? That same love is granted to us, and then he says, abide in that love, right? So he's now told us to abide in his word. It's that we're abiding in him, or that he's abiding in us, and we're abiding in his word. And when we read his word, we're coming to a knowledge of him. Okay, and as we come to a knowledge of him, then we're coming to a knowledge of his love for us. And as we come to a knowledge of his love for us, then we can abide in that love. We can be secure in that love. We can be safe in that love. And then we can express that love back to him and to his other creatures, our friends. Okay. Verse 10, if you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be made full. My joy, right? The fruit of the Spirit might be in you. This is my commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. Back up a little bit. Verse 10 caused me to pause a little bit. Right? And maybe it causes you to pause a little bit. He says, if you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. So is the converse then true, that if you don't keep my commandments, then you're not loved by me? Right? Is that what he's saying? I don't think that that's what he's saying at all. I think that what he is saying here, again, going back to the verse 5, he says, apart from me, you can do nothing. Right? Meaning you can't keep my commandments. You can't bear the fruit that I want you to bear without abiding in me. And apart from me, you can do nothing. So I think that what he's really saying here in verse 10, he's really saying this, that the fact that first of all, I abide in you and that you abide in me, and that you know my love for you, that will naturally lead to and result in you keeping my commandments. That will be the outflow of this. Right? Go back to verse 31. He says, but the world, verse 31 in chapter 14, it says, but that the world might know that I love the Father, and as the Father gave me commandment, even so I do. And what he is essentially saying is that the world knows that I love the Father, I'm going to keep his commandments. I love the Father, and I'm going to keep his commandments. And that was the motivation for Jesus's death on the cross, quite honestly. He kept the commandment of the Father. The Father says, no, this is, right? I mean, he goes into the Garden of Gethsemane, prays, not my will be done, but your will be done. The will of the Father was for him to die on the cross for humanity. And he kept that commandment, and he did his job. Okay? And he did it out of a love for the Father. Okay? And I was thinking about this, and I was listening to another pastor, and the pastor just kind of made the point that, and I thought this was really interesting because I started to reflect on my own relationships. He said that the motivation of love is such a better motivation for obedience, essentially, and such a better motivation for really all of our actions. And he just brought up, he just said, think of some of your most precious relationships, and think about how difficult it is to disappoint those people that are of, the people that you really love. And I naturally thought of Becky, right? There are constraints that I put on myself, huh? Of course. There are constraints that I put on myself to protect my relationship with Becky, right? And to maintain my relationship with Becky. And I do that not because I know I'm supposed to and it's the right thing to do, though it certainly is. But I do that because I love her. And more importantly, I do that because not only do I love her, but I love who's behind her, and that's Jesus Christ. And I love him, and I don't want to disappoint him, and I don't want to disappoint her. And I'm motivated by that. And it's kept my nose clean for a very long time, right? So anyway, but that's what's being said here, I think, in verse 10, and that's what he said in verse 31 of chapter 14. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love. Meaning this, that the fruit of your love for me and your abiding in my love is that you're keeping my commandments. Okay, that's the data, if you will.
And it's so critical to truly understand the knife edge in these passages, because you can so quickly get them inverted and be outside then of, you can spend years frustrated feeling like you're doing these things and not coming to the actual fruit of these things.
You're trying to put fruit on the tree, right?
Yes.
Instead of let fruit come out of the tree.
Yeah. So really important to understand that difference.
Yeah, Jan.
I have a question on verse 10.
Yeah.
If you keep my commandments, is that the commandment portion of it? What's he talking about? The 10 commandments, the commandments to love him?
Yeah.
With your heart?
I think that, so what commandments are we talking about, right? So he goes on to say this in verse 12, and that's why I read all the way down to verse 12. I'm glad that you brought it up. He says, this is my commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. And so that's one of them. I think that he would, taking Jesus' own words in another passage, he says this, because he was asked by a Pharisee, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus says, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then he went on and said, and the second one's like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Right? And it starts with then a love of God. And then an outcome of that is going to be to love your neighbor. Okay? And he goes on to say that he says, for all the commandments, whatever you see in the Old Testament are captured in these two things. If you truly love the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you love your neighbors as yourself, you will keep all the other commandments. Right? And even explaining what I was explaining with Becky, right? Adultery, thou shalt not commit adultery. Yes, that's a commandment. I don't commit adultery, and I haven't committed adultery because I love Becky. I love her as myself. I wouldn't want her to do that to me, and I'm certainly not going to do that to her, right? So in those two commandments, keep it real simple: love him, love your neighbor. Okay. Now, understand, going back to our spiritual law, we can't love him unless we know his love. I mean, that's what he says. He says he first loved us. We loved because he first loved us. We are responding naturally to him. Okay? In Luke 9, verses 23 through 26, let's go ahead and flip there, actually. Because this is, I think, really germane to this. What is the commandments, right? Jesus gives us an expression of what it looks like to love God. He says in this, Luke 9, verse 23, he says, if anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself. Let him take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life shall lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake, he is the one who will save it. For what is a man profited if he gains the whole world and he loses or forfeits himself? Okay? So the idea being, if anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily and follow me. That's exactly what he did, right? I think that probably the first time the disciples heard this were like, what is he talking about? Take up your cross. I mean, that would be like me saying to you, take up lethal injection and follow me. You'd be like, what is he talking about? Right? Or take up the electric chair and follow me. Okay? That would be the idea of what he was saying. But he then went on to demonstrate that. And then the response by us, we can all look back at that, and we in the 21st century can look back at this and say, oh yeah, it makes sense. I mean, we can make sense of that passage because we saw him do it. Okay, and then we can respond in like. Okay, so that's the commandment, right? So and what if going back to this in verse 10, Jan, what he is saying there is when you're abiding in my love, you know of my love. You know of who I am. Okay, you're learning from me. The outflow of that will be that you'll keep these commandments. And the commandments are love me and love my neighbor. Okay, from him. Right? It starts again at he is the fountainhead of all of this. Okay, and that's even some of what caused me to think, well, let's examine these other worldviews. We have to have an explanation for these things. Okay, good question.
And that's where we can get boogered up, is if we get that.
That's the technical term.
It's Greek.
It's in the Greek, it's a boogerario.
Well, and it'd also be interesting, did you look up that if there? Because there's those 3 class conditions with the word
No.
if, and it can sometimes mean since, and we always translate it as if, but there's 3
Yeah.
actually different.
Well, so I did do some investigation on this. Not as straightforward as those class conditions have been presented.
Well,
but anyway.
but that's where, that was something that the Lord exposed to me a few years ago. These guys were really little. And and that was when I coined the phrase backdoor Christianity, because I could read through this text and my first instinct would be to look at the commandment. So what do I need to do? And it was actually through, I think I've shared this with you, is the Colossians 3 or 2 or Colossians.
Well, tell me what you're going to say, and then I'll tell you what.
Where it was like reverse order, right? That you have died and your life is now hidden
It's
with
Colossians
Christ.
3. Colossians 3.
And so set your mind on things above, because and it was kind of like he just showed me that, oh, I have to invert how I've been doing things, and I need need to go up and understand my heavenly nature, what's happened heavenly to me, and then that trickles down. I don't have to try to figure out how to get my base self up to here, if that makes sense. And so sometimes when I read through this passage, the Lord had to retool my thinking on it so that I could actually understand it for what it was actually trying to say, because I would see commandment, or I would see
Well,
what I need to do.
when I saw commandment, it loomed.
Mhm.
It was big, so I thought, oh,
Oh no.
Another one to keep track of. Oh my goodness, I have too many of them. But it really does, and I mean, that's really is very simple. I think that what he's saying is that when you abide in my love, the natural outflow of that is that you will keep my commandments. It's the evidence. So he's saying, I think that you have to look at it as verse 10 as him just saying, the evidence of you abiding in my love is you're keeping my commandments. That's
Yeah.
how you can look at. You can look at someone and say, oh, that person is keeping his commandments. That means that they must be abiding in him. It's the
comes
evidence. It's the
naturally.
fruit. Just like when we look at an orange tree, we look at the orange tree and we say, oh, that tree is an orange tree. And why do we know that? Because there's fruit on it that's an orange, right? Now, where does that come from, though?
The tree
It-
over there.
Right? It's not the tree. What makes the orange tree an orange tree is not the orange, it's the DNA. It comes from within. It's the natural outcome of the DNA within the orange tree. Right? So these were the keeping of the commandments are the natural outcome of being a Christian. He's living in you and you're living in him. And it's a process. I'm not saying that we all do it perfectly, right? I mean, I have done it perfectly so far. But, you know, right, Becky? I think this weekend is testimony of that. All right. Now let's go ahead and move on, because there's something really, I think, interesting. Let's look at verse 13 here, okay? He says this, greater love, now he's going to define this love for us. Greater love has no one than this, that one lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you slaves, for the slave does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends. For all things that I have heard from the Father I have made known to you. It's an amazing passage, right? And we go, oh, we're in verse 13. Well, we just read the first 13, 14, and 15. Of John 15. Yep, John 15. Yep.
I found it.
Okay. So you are my friends, right? So, I mean, he's already said up here, he says, as the Father loves you, or as the Father loved me, so I love you. Now he's saying, you're my friends. Meaning I'm not treating you like slaves anymore. You're my friend. And here's how you know you're my friend. Because I'm telling you what I'm up to. Guys, I've told you that I'm dying tomorrow. I'm going somewhere. I'm leaving. And I'm not going to be with you anymore. But you're going to see me again. Don't worry, you'll see me again. You're going to be happy. All right? I'm going to rise from the dead. You're going to see me again. And then I'm leaving you again. But don't worry, I'm going to send someone to you. And that someone's going to be the helper. Right? I mean, he's telling them all these things. And there's lots of other things I would really want to tell you, but I can't tell you those things because you can't understand them. But the helper will tell you all those things. Right? I want you to know what I'm up to because you're my friend. Right? And that's what we do as friends. You're my friend, and I want you to know what I'm up to. I want you to know what I'm thinking. I want you to know my plans. And that's what's going on. Okay? And we have the Word. We have the Word of God to illustrate that. We're his friend. We're his child, we're his friend, we're even in some passages his sheep. Okay, right? There's all those relationships. We're his amazingly, if you will, as intimate as this is, we're his spouse. Okay, it's just an expression of how intimate he wants the relationship to be. Okay.
Well, and in the evidence, as you were talking about,
Yeah.
what'd you call it?
Data.
Yeah, no, not data.
Data is what
Data.
No, data.
No, you said something with the word evidence in it. Explanatory.
Explanatory
evidence, right?
power.
Okay, sorry, it doesn't have anything to do with evidence, but explanatory power, right? So
Yeah.
within a relationship between like you and I, if you knew you were going somewhere and I would have no understanding of why you were gone,
Yeah.
you would take every opportunity to try to communicate somehow to me.
Yeah.
So that I wasn't sitting there.
And then I'm coming back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huge. Like that would be hugely on your mind. That would be hugely on my mind. Like if my kids, I wouldn't want my kids to be thinking my mom just left. Like I would be like, no, you gotta know what's happening and why it's happening. So
Yep. That's
that's
exactly
it.
right.
That's a huge.
We're always sitting there like,
He just wakes up, whoa.
Yeah.
Wake up. Hey, they're talking about me. All right. Now, go on to verse 16. It says, extending this friendship, right? Not only are you my friends, but I chose you, right? You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that their fruit should remain, and whenever you ask of the Father in my name, he may give it to you. This I command you, that you love one another. Now, interesting, I'm going to say one thing here, okay? He chose this, but he goes on to say this, and he says, appointed you that you should go on and bear fruit, and that your fruit should remain. Right? Remain, meaning be eternal. That this fruit would be there, and it would actually, the word is abide. I mean, it could say abide. It says the exact same word that he's been using, abide in me. Right? So, and then he goes on and says this, he gives that prayer promise again. And whatever you ask of the Father in my name, he will give it to you. Right? So this qualifies BMWs. Because a BMW is not a fruit that's going to remain. A BMW can get slammed into and be gone. Okay? It can get stolen, it can get, so there's, slammed into. What happens when you get in an accident? Slam into.
I-N-T-O, not into.
Yeah. Or it could get cut into, depends on how. Anyway. So that's just my comment, right? I mean, because a lot of people will take these passages and say, well, you can ask God for whatever he wants, and you should get it. And if you don't get it, it's because you don't have enough faith. So, well, that's not what Jesus is saying here. It's not at all what he's saying. Okay, and we come into harmony with him, and then we ask essentially our prayers are already pre-cast by him. It's like, this is exactly what I want to give. Okay.
Well, and it's so demonstrated by Jesus saying, I have legions of angels at my disposal
right.
that I could call in a moment.
Yeah.
And he doesn't do that.
After Peter cuts off the guy's ear,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
Right? He could do whatever it is. And in that moment, that may have been the thing that he felt like the most was absolutely needed.
Right.
But yet he didn't. And that's where we have to come to in that phrase, that we have to be able to get to a point where we can ask for our own death, if that's according to his will, right? Our own physical death here, that's a temporary, and that's a very different way of thinking than what most people think when they read these things.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So.
Because his will can be very different from what we
Yeah.
can hear.
Right. So here's what I think we should do. I think we're going to stop right there, because he's going to shift gears now, and he's going to start to think about the world. Okay. And he's going to go into this passage about, you should expect this from the world. Okay. And I think there's some things that are, I think, really germane to the society that we live in and what he says here. And I want to look at that. And so we're gonna look at that, I think, next week. Okay. Essentially how the world's going to treat us and our expectation of that. Okay. We're done.
I went fast, and I think you were asleep for the rest of it.
Yeah. What's your question, Jordan?
I really agree with the thought process of that love is universal, and that's
Yeah.
an explanation for God, because that's what I've always thought